2023, and I'm honored to have with me Professor Carlos Blanco. Today we're going to be discussing Latin America in general, but in particular situations in Ecuador and Argentina.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Randall Bach, in your program, your TV show. Well, the situation has been very complicated in recent days. In Ecuador, as you know, there was the assassination of a presidential candidate, a journalist, Fernando Villavicencio, and that brought a lot of turmoil. He was assassinated just about 1 week before the election day, and that was very complicated and made very complicated the situation in Ecuador. The election was held because the president of Ecuador has the constitutional right to dissolve the Congress, but at the same time, when he does that, he has to call for a new presidential election. That was what happened. President Guillermo Lasso took that measure on politics, on Ecuadorian politics, because he was going to be impeached several times, and he tried to solve the turmoil, just quitting, saying, well, I will dissolve the Congress, I will call elections, and I won't run for re-election. That was what happened. And the new president is going to finish his term. It's going to last almost 2 years from now. For that election, candidate Fernando Villavicencio was assassinated. And the problem is that economy and insecurity are the most important problems in Ecuador. Within 3 years, Ecuador had become the top exporter of cocaine to Europe. According to a European drug monitoring agency, where the use of the drug has been rising. 11 days, as I said before the election, Fernando Villavicencio was assassinated after leaving a campaign rally in Quito. He was one of the most outspoken person in Ecuador. He repeatedly warned of links between drug gangs and government officials and politicians. And days before his assassination, had spoken publicly about threats from a local criminal group. There are two main groups in Ecuador linked to Mexican cartels. One is linked to Jalisco Nueva Generación, and the other one to the Sinaloa cartel. Both are operating in Ecuador, that has become the main exporter to Europe. The election, the now candidates that ran the election in October, that will go to the elections in October 15, and the runoff election, are Luisa González and Daniel Noboa. Daniel Noboa is a young entrepreneur, 35 years old. He is, I would say, center-right candidate. And Luisa González is supported by former President Correa. Correa was president between 2007 and 2017. for 10 years. They had these candidates, Luisa Gonzalez and Daniel Noboa, have to run again because no candidates received enough votes to be elected president. The winner in on the October 15 runoff will govern, as I said, only for the remainder of Lasso's unfinished term, less than 2 years. The problem is Ecuador now has a pretty dire economic situation. First, because the fall of oil prices. That's one thing. Ecuador has a, it's a oil producer and exporter. The depreciation of Ecuadorian crude oil prices, specifically the crude oil prices of Ecuador, and also the reduction of the volume of that production. That's one problem. And it has led to another problem, of course, interlinked to this, which is the fiscal deficit that was calculated to be something about 2% of the GDP and is going to be close to 4% of the GDP. Although Ecuador has a very peculiar situation with money. It has replaced the sucre many years ago, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, by the dollar. It's a dollarized economy. That has kept Ecuador in a very good way through these years. But now the increase of expenditures through the government of Correa, with the windfall profits from oil, created this situation of deficit now because there is not enough oil resources. That's one a specific situation, economic.
So I'm going to break in with a question. If I may, I apologize. So there was Correa, and then he was succeeded by what is it, Lenin Moreno? I can't remember the name. I'm getting
Lenin Moreno. Yeah.
And after that, Lasso. My understanding is Correa is part of this pink revolution, leftist, whatever, in line with Evo Morales and Chavez and so forth. But we have political labels, center, right, left, so forth. How do things change politically and or with expenditures under one regime or another? Is there kind of we have the kind of the permanent bureaucracy here, and people call it the uniparty in the U.S. that things don't necessarily change that much fiscally, financially between one regime and another. I don't necessarily agree with that, but the example I have is like a speedboat versus a cruise ship. Speedboat, you can turn around, you can go anywhere you want, you can go in little alleys, but a cruise ship, it's hard to turn. Our economy is cruise ships, and who's navigating it in reality, and how much change are there from one regime to another, and do the presidential parties make any difference in the overall economy of these countries if in fact there's kind of this narco terror and or narco flow of cash going through them?
Well, the problem is that Correa is a populist. Actually, he's exiled.
He's in Belgium or something.
He's in Belgium because he was prosecuted because the bribes coming from Odebrecht, the Brazilian company in Ecuador. But he is a populist. He was a part of the Chavez gang in Latin America. Mm-hmm. But also he profited from the oil windfall resources that Ecuador had, and all the oil countries as Venezuela and others had. So he was very popular and very populist because he had resources. But when Moreno uh, got to office, the situation began to change in two senses: in the economic sense, but also in the political sense, because he was promoted initially by Correa, but he had a different approach to uh, economic policies in Ecuador. He was more linked to the idea that the state had to be diminished. He was more open to markets. He was not a populist, and he broke with Correa. And as a result of that, the situation in Ecuador evolved to elect a president like Lasso, who is a businessman, I would say center right president, and Correa uh, kept his constituency in much of it, and he had been pressing against governments in Ecuador, against Lenin Moreno, and now against Lasso. And what is happening with this candidate, the one that he supported, the Luisa, what's her name? I forgot it. Uh, Luisa Gonzalez,
Right.
is that she became uh, the representative of Correa, and she got all the support from Correistas. But it's possible that Noboa, this young businessman, can win because he has, maybe all the opponents to Correa will vote for him. I think that's something that might happen. I would point out that in Ecuador, there have been uh, this problem of insecurity that led and the link with criminal gangs and drug trafficking that has contributed to the number of violent deaths in Ecuador, which doubled from 2021 to 2022 when 4,600 people died, the most ever recorded in a year. Uh, in As I read in the New York Times article, the country is well on track to break the annual record again with 3,500 violent deaths tallied in the first half of 2023. So there is a very complicated situation in Ecuador, and it goes along with other countries that are in the same situation in Latin America. The New York Times says that some faction in FARC, the guerrilla FARC,
In
uh,
Colombia.
in Colombia, that refused to sign, I'm reading, that refused to sign the accord moved their business to Ecuador, where they could continue operating away from the watchful eye of the Colombian government. Ecuador had long been a transit hub for drugs coming from Colombia and Peru, but after 2016, local groups became involved in manufacturing and distribution, joining forces with Mexican and even Albanian cartels. So this is a very complicated situation in which you cannot assess domestic politics without the environment, the international environment, the criminal environment that is surrounding not only Ecuador, But you have in many Latin American countries what we can call the gray zones, mainly in the borders, like Colombia and Venezuela, Colombia and Ecuador, Ecuador and Peru, Peru and Bolivia, that are controlled by criminal gangs nowadays linked to this international drug trafficking network. That's a very sad, risky, and dramatic situation in the region.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So let me ask you, the security situation in Ecuador has deteriorated significantly with, the rise in violence you're talking about, the drug gangs and mafias. How can the next government effectively address these security challenges? And more, how do you see the role of Korea and its potential comeback, preventing even, Noboa's ascension, and having them kind of have the same, roadblocks and issues and stagnation that occurred with Lasso?
I have been seeing some polls, very recent, about the votes in Ecuador. How could the outcome be? And what I have seen is that Noboa will win, by like 10% over uh, the Luisa, uh, his contender. Uh, but he's like 45 percent in the polls that I saw, and Luisa Gonzalez is about 35. He should win, but and that would be just a government for 2 years, and maybe he's going to take care of the problems that Ecuador have has, and also he is a very, I would say, balanced person. He is not, very furious against Correa. He's trying to calm waters in Ecuador that are very uh, messy right now. But the problem is, if Correa is going to accept that, saying that the Noboa wins and supporting, this stabilization to get some policies, state policies supported by the main candidates, or if Correa is going to create more problems against this new president, uh, expecting that Noboa wins the election. And the other problem is that in a country like Ecuador, where the criminal international gangs are operating, you have to have an approach that is international as well. You cannot do that without international support. Uh, Correa and his government uh, shut down the base of Manta in Ecuador, where the U.S. Air Force had planes to help control the drug trafficking in the region. Correa closed it, and closed the collaboration with the American institutions, with the DEA, and with the law enforcement agencies that could work against drug trafficking, and the rise of drug trafficking went, beyond any control. Would Noboa open again the collaboration with the United States and other countries for combating crime, that's an open question.
Yeah,
If
so
he does so, we can understand that this international fight against criminal gangs can go on. If not, they are done.
right. So this is not necessarily fully germane, but recently there was cocaine found at the White House in Washington D.C. And I think we all have our general suspects of whose that might be. But I think it points to the fact that cocaine is a recreational drug. I think that crosses classes. It's not poverty alone. There are a lot of wealthy people who like their cocaine. What is the answer for this? We don't have to necessarily go down this road fully, but if the United States has cocaine at the White House, and at the other hand, historically they've tried to have the war on drugs, which is difficult because drugs are an inanimate object. You're talking about a different kind of war. You're talking about crop, exfoliation, all that kind of stuff. What is the war on drugs? Where does it stand now? Can there be one if there's continued demand? How do we affect the demand? Should there be legalization? How does Latin America look at this, potentially money-growing crop, which is, I guess, a little bit, better for the farmer than growing cotton or coffee? Or you tell me. How does this cycle end where we're kind of pitting, a marketplace for demand for a drug versus kind of a natural order of people making money from it on the supply end who have, are impoverished and may not have other means of getting ahead? Where does this all lead?
If I had an answer to that question, I would win the Nobel Prize.
You might win 2 or 3, actually.
Yeah, chemistry and
yeah, you could go in for medicine. If you could do the addiction part, we'll give you one for medicine. If you could figure out, anyway.
Well, I think you can find drugs everywhere, and that doesn't mean anything. That in the sense that besides that the problem is spreading all over the world and all over the classes and all over society divide. I think just a thorough approach to the drug issue, because it's a medical problem, is a psychological problem, is a criminal problem, is many problems at the same time, and also is, as I said, an international problem. Many people taking the traditional American side would say, if those Latin American countries wouldn't produce drugs, American people wouldn't buy it. And from Latin America, many even presidents say, if we wouldn't have demand on these drugs, they wouldn't be produced. And the solution that some people get to that is, well, let's legalize it. And that's, I would say, a partial answer to this. I have some observations to that policy, but it's a huge contemporary problem for the world, and has to be considered as that, as such, and that's something that Ecuador or Colombia by themselves cannot solve.
Okay, so I'm going to turn our focus to a face in the news here. This is Javier Milei, and The Economist. I think they could have done better by this. So can Javier Milei's radical libertarianism save Argentina? I'm not sure he's a radical libertarian. I think libertarian is a thing. It's like if you were a Catholic and you're against abortion, I don't think that makes you a radical Catholic. I think he is, kind of doctrinaire libertarian, for better or for worse. Our interview explores his wild economic ideas and his authoritarian streak. So I think this is, there's a lot of begging the question here, petitio principi, where they have their own opinions embedded in the questions they ask. And I'm not sure he has an authoritarian streak. Could you tell us a little about his history? How would we know if he has an authoritarian streak? What's his past? What's his current? And given that he's supposed to save Argentina, what is he saving Argentina from? Why do we need, theoretically, his radical libertarianism if there weren't a problem, of course, brought about by somebody who's not presumably a libertarian?
Well, the problem is the context. He is very radical in the situation of Argentina. He is a person that I think his most important attractive is that he is against what he called the caste of Argentina. The caste.
CASE, the caste system,
Yeah,
the social strata, the kind
CSE.
of fixed elites.
Yeah, he says all politicians belong to the caste, and he is fighting against that.
So what caste is he from? What's his past? What's his current job? How did he get into politics?
Well, he has been he comes from a TV show, talk show, and he is very outspoken, and he is uh, the one that keeps saying I would suppress the central bank. Will establish my two main allies are going to be the United States and Israel. He is saying things in a way that appeals to the people that are fed up with politicians in Argentina that has been in a crisis during, especially this government of Alberto Fernandez, the president, and Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, the widow of President Kirchner, former President Kirchner, and people in Argentina seems to be very upset about the current leaders. Argentina has been mired in severe crisis for years now. Deep ideological divisions between political players, as well as an economy is struggling with rampant inflation, foreign debt, and prolonged recession. Now there are three candidates that came from the primaries, the mandatory primaries that were held a few weeks ago. They are Javier Milei, he calls himself libertarian, the left wing Sergio Massa from the current government, and the conservative candidate Patricia Bullrich, who is a person that very well um, set according to specific policies, is a very good candidate. Sergio Massa has set himself up as the opponent of the economically liberal section of the political landscape. Um, Patricia Bullrich is the presidential candidate of the right liberal opposition alliance Juntos por el Cambio, Together for Change, the leader of the party of former President Mauricio Macri, and Milei. Uh, Milei victory was a turning point in Argentinian politics. He is an economist, and he also provokes heated debates about many things. As I said, he blames the political caste for Argentina's national crisis, and he promised, let me read this citation. He promised we will put an end to the parasitic and useless political caste in this country. So, as you see, is very popular because of that. He says that the central banks should be abolished. He has said that climate change is a lie and has characterized sex education as a ploy to destroy the family. Uh, well, and he has been very popular because of that. And I think is what happened in many countries, not only in Argentina, that many people are tired of politics as usual, and they can select left wing people or right wing people regardless of their ideological uh, mindset, but looking for something different. If you see Latin America in the in 3 decades, uh, many presidents have been impeached and couldn't finish their terms because people want change, want you know results, uh, outcomes that can be uh, according to what they expect, and that's not the case. I think that's something related to how democracy is working, not only in Latin America but in the world. We see here in the United States a very polarized country with the realm of politics changing, uh, where you don't know what the parties stand for, what the candidates are for, and that's a situation that is not just in Latin America, although Latin America has characteristic, specific characteristics, and in some countries are in very bad economic shape. But polarization
So,
came to the round of politics and is going to stay there for a while, I think.
so this is a terrible joke. My father was a lawyer, so I'm going to put this out there. There's a joke. How do you keep a lawyer from drowning? And the answer is you take your foot off his neck. So the implicit in the joke is that you could have him drown because you've kept him underwater. So I'm going to use this joke as a metaphor for economies. My feeling is that oftentimes, how do you keep an economy from dying? Well, you take your foot off its neck. My feeling is that, oftentimes governments often, and in my taste, more often the populist types, they raid the treasury. They print money. They want to get, their kind of, say, lower middle class caste paid and so forth, and they tend to bring inflation. Venezuela, we've seen this. Argentina, we've seen this. So, you know, and again, I tend to be center right, and my feeling is that libertarian. I'm not a libertarian per se, but oftentimes the best way to let people kind of progress is to let them do their business and let them do their jobs. Fewer regulations, a secure money supply, and so forth. Oddly and inimically, the Argentine peso took a real dive on the news of Milei's primary victory. What are your thoughts about how Argentina got into the dire situation it has? What are the parallels with Venezuela? I remember Carlos Menem some time ago as president. How did things compare then under those politics? And do you think that kind of the economic situation of these countries depends left and right? When we have what's called populist or pink revolution or whatever, do the economies do better, worse? What ultimately gives people satisfaction?
I think in Latin America there are several specific issues that we can address. The first one is that Latin America had in the 19th century a lot of caudillos.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, the caudillos that came from independence and began to rule in in Latin American countries were famous caudillos, and I think democracy in Latin America inherited the caudillista vision, and that vision uh, creates the idea that the presidents, elected democratic presidents, are the same as the old caudillos, all the strong man that Latin American had. And the caudillos would be the power, the rulers that could solve any problem of any citizen in the country. Well, there is a fantasy in most of our countries about the power of the president. Presidents are, you know, the ones that, being the heirs of the strong man, can solve everything. So people think presidents are as powerful as they imagine, and I think that's wrong. Most of the presidents are prisoners of their entourage, of their promises, of the institutional setting, and the margin of maneuver that they have is very little. That's one thing. The other thing is that in many countries, the state grew because became the coffers of the nation, uh, mainly having like Venezuela and Ecuador and other countries as well, being exporters of commodities, in the case of Venezuela and Ecuador, of oil, and the state became very powerful in getting all the resources to distribute to the citizens. And that created the idea that, you know, getting to office and having the resources of the state, the problems could be solved. And that's not the way in which societies work. You cannot substitute the everyday work of people, workers, entrepreneurs, and all the people that constitute a society. So I think that's something that hasn't worked in the region and has been creating for years, for centuries, the idea, not in all countries, but in some countries like Ecuador and Venezuela, the idea that the governments can solve the problems for everyone in the
Well,
society.
they might have a nostalgia. You know, in 1964, Detroit was the wealthiest city in the United States, if not the world. And in 1964, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America, and I think the fourth wealthiest in the world. I'm not sure where Ecuador stood in that, but you know there might be a nostalgia for things of a simpler time. I'm going to just kind of maybe segue into you know the role of the Roman Catholic Church and morality in Latin America, and you know not necessarily the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, but you know general religiosity and adherence to moral standards. I think if we go back to 1964, the halcyon days, there was not the same drug trade. There was not the same level of addiction. Heroin addiction was, you know, nearly unheard of in the U.S. We didn't have crack cocaine. Anyway, there were a lot of differences. You know, if you look at the picture, you know, the subways in 1964, people, you know, are reading the newspaper, but they, you know, have hats and they got jackets and ties, the men, and there's a whole kind of different standard of what's acceptable. Uh, I you know, I think in a sense it's almost opposite day. Um, you know, as far as Latin America and the church, not fully, but in this case, Pope Francis, I think, he first of all is Argentine, ironically or coincidentally, and I think he's left of center, if not actual communist. And he's having a little bit of friction with Javier Milei. But maybe you could, I don't know if you feel like addressing the role or the diminishing role of the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America. What are standards like? Is there a nostalgia for earlier, better, simpler times of say, prosperity and rule of law?
Well, I wouldn't say that there is a specific problem with the religion, although the Catholic Church has become very not as popular as it used to be. And now Protestantism is rising in Latin America in recent decades. But there is a situation now with Pope Francis, because Francis is a Jesuit. I would say center left person.
You're being generous.
Yeah. in Venezuela, for instance, many people think it is a radical left, and I'm being gentle and nice. And Francis, Pope Francis, hasn't uh, gone into some problems that we have in Latin America. Let me mention only one: Nicaraguan priests that have been imprisoned, tortured, exiled, and the voice of Francis hasn't been heard as loud as their own church expects. And also in countries like Venezuela, where there are uh, frequent violation of human rights, people in prison, tortured, exiled, and there is a lack of voice of the church, especially the church, the Pope, having as the general of the Jesuits in the Vatican a Venezuelan priest that he is close advisor to Pope Francis. You know, the Jesuits have a general uh, leader in the Vatican, and that's a Venezuelan. Actually, he was a professor at the Catholic University in Caracas. So I would say his voice is needed, badly needed in Latin America. And he has been seen in the Argentinian situation very close to the now Vice President Cristina Kirchner. And well, before then, they were in opposed situations when he was a priest in Argentina, but now he's the Pope. So we have sad news from the Pope in Argentina, but also we have something to be glad to recognize, which is Lionel Messi, that we all appreciate as a football player.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that there. So
You don't like football, or you don't like Messi?
no. I'm okay with Messi, and I used to play soccer and I coached it for years. I'm not sure that it's fully across the board. I think we have so many sports here. Soccer tends to be kind of universal everywhere else, and we just have a lot of competing sports. But I understand the situation. I know a lot of my kids I coached certainly idolized him. But I want to maybe, actually, since I have you here, I'm wondering if you can touch on this counterpoint here. Argentine priests defend Pope Francis over shameful Milei attacks, and so there's a tweet. Maybe you can leave out any could you tell us what's the picture mean here, um, and what does Milei's tweet mean? I think it was dated 2018. So what was he up to then, and what was the response? And is there kind of a brewing kind of culture war in Argentina? Um, and is the Pope represented here? Says Argentine priests defend Pope Francis. What about the people? And so maybe
Can you put the tweet? Here says, dedicate to you, Pontifex Francis, the Pope, leftist, son of a bitch. You are saying you are promoting communism in the world. You are the representative of the maligned in the house of God.
All right. So what is this this picture refer to here?
I think the gladiator, the one that has the sword, represents what Milei wants to portray, killing the demon in the highest mountain of the world, and and you know, I think is the kind, it reveals more than the picture that we've seen,
Right.
the approach of Milei to not only to the Pope but to people that don't agree with him,
Mm-hmm.
like the Pope.
Right. So I'm going to maybe go to policy then, as we kind of
You,
round
maybe we should come from heaven
to Earth. Okay, so
earth.
Javier Milei proposes dollarization in Argentina as a solution to eliminate the central bank and curb inflation. What are the moral and technical arguments for this monetary shift? Um, and moreover, he suggests kind of an intermediate option for dollarization where people voluntarily convert the dollars until 2/3 of the monetary base is converted. Do you believe this approach is feasible, to gain public support? And how has it been done, not de jure, but de facto in Venezuela lately?
Well, there is a very interesting interview with former president of Ecuador, Jamil Mawad, that was deposed in 2000 by a military coup because of dollarization. He was the one that introduced, that approved dollarization in Ecuador, and as a result of that, there was a turmoil, and he was deposed by the military. Some Argentinian supporters of Milei have called former president of Ecuador, Jamil Mawad, to do some talks about how dollarization could be carried out. And President Mawad said that he failed because he was deposed uh, on dollarization because he needed at that time, and dollarization needs three main pillars: the technical support. You know, dollarization should be done in a proper way. You have to have the proper amount of international reserves to back the change of the local currency for dollars. You have to have, you know, the support of the international, um, you know, some international organizations. You have to have clear mind on uh, the technical issues of dollarization. You have to have social support in the sense that he says Ecuador was prepared for dollarization because 70% of the population were using already dollar as the currency for their transactions.
All right, so it's de facto.
Yeah, that was the facto. And you, when you have, you know, 30% you have to dollarize not the whole system, but 30% of the population of the transactions that people carried out, and political support. And he says, I failed with this one. I had the technical uh, problems solved. I had the social support for that, but I didn't have the political support. And that's why I was uh, uh,
Right. So
pro.
let me ask you a side question. What is the rationale for dollarization? I mean, I have it in my own head. I'm just curious. What do you see as the reason for it? Why would a government want it, and as opposed to what? For everything there is.
Let me finish with the answer uh, of Argentina. The problem that Mawad says Argentina has right now is that dollarization is an issue of the electoral campaign. And when you have electoral campaign, things get to polarization, and the people who support uh, Milei, for instance, are for dollarization, and people who support other candidates are against, and that's a problem. That halts the social support and political support that is needed for that policy, contrary to what happened, at least in social terms, in Ecuador. The dollarization is a process in which you change the national currency for the dollar, the foreign currency, and the main issue is that when, bless you, when the central bank has the power to issue money, you can print money even if you don't have reserves. If you are, you know, conservative in fiscal terms, you can have your national currency without problems, because you have the tools to stop printing money. If you have, because the central bank, the role of the central bank is to control inflation.
Right.
And when real central bank uh, does its job, it
Yeah.
doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, monetary theory is that the bank should only be increasing the monetary supply in proportion to the amount of actual increase in GDP. So the example I like to use is if you had, I don't know, Club Med on an island someplace, and it's Club Med, so they don't want to carry wallets around. They give people a certain number of trinkets or beads, and they can buy whatever they want, jewelry, or I don't know, they can buy other things or favors from each other. And all of a sudden, somebody dumps, 1,000 more trinkets. Let's say there are 500 trinkets there, or bracelets, we'll call them. And let's say that people, there's 100 people on the island. They have 500 bracelets. They're using them. They like them. And somebody clandestinely dumps another 500. I mean, the value of each of those bracelets is going to drop in half, because you can get them so much more easily, and their value changes. And so if you had a Club Med that grew, and you went from 100 people to 110 people, you might need 10% more bracelets to accommodate people. But if all of a sudden you drop in 100% more bracelets, they're not going to value those bracelets, and the bracelets are not going to have the same ability to buy other services or interest from people within. And so I think there's always a kind of the temptation, getting back to religion. There's a temptation to have something now. There's the kind of garden Eve, the apple.
The problem is that the monetary policy is something that the central bank has the right to carry it out. You can uh, uh, have some uh, deficit if you want to have some effect in the society. You can have a tolerable margin of inflation, 2%, 3%. That's something that gives the central bank opportunities for uh, managing the money supply and having some economic results. If you want to push the economy at some point, you can.
No, I know people do that. They think this the bank is kind of their toy to stimulate and whatnot. But I think there's also just the idea of printing money that the government can buy things that they promised because they are the one printing the money. And so, I mean, if you terrible,
If you don't have an independent central bank, if you
right,
have an independent central
right.
bank,
And so,
you
so
can
the concept
do
is
that.
to dollarize it. They're trying to get a more stable currency. Now, I think there are some issues whether the dollar is going to be stable ultimately. I mean, I'm not, I wish them luck with that. Um, but obviously we're having our own bout of inflation. It's nothing like Argentine inflation or Venezuelan inflation, but we have more than we've had in like 40 years.
Well,
Uh,
you can see that in some countries, like in Venezuela in 2018, there was that year, that just in 1 year, 67,000% of inflation. 67,000% in
right,
just one
right.
year.
And how does that happen then? How does that happen in Venezuela? How does that happen in Argentina? I mean, what are the motivations? I mean, what makes that happen in certain places, not others?
Well, in Venezuela, clearly, Chavez and then Maduro went against private sector, foreign investment, taking the oil industry, the
And
state,
does it involve the overprinting of money?
yeah, and not having resources to back.
I mean,
Uh,
my feeling understanding is this is just kind of a trick. If you took an example, I mean, terrible example maybe, but if you took this, thermos or a plastic bottle, if you had a plastic bottle and you could go back to the Middle Ages, and have a plastic bottle, I mean, it'd be a hugely, incredibly valuable thing. You could store water, you could carry it around, it's light, it's effective, you could fold it up practically, and people would be marveling, oh my God, what is this thing? And it screws on top. They would a plastic bottle would be a hugely valuable item. Now that's if there's one of them, and probably if there were a few thousand of them, it'd still be valuable. But you go today and people throw plastic bottles away. If you go on the pathway, they're littered. I mean, there's no value to them because they're omnipresent and there's so many of them. I assume they're just enough, printed as it were. But clearly, value has to do with rarity. And so when you flood the system with dollars or Zimbabwean dollar, whatever they had there, or bolivars, whatever, the value disappears. Anyway,
yeah,
so
the governments do that, buying time, just buying time, because printing money now gives the population the sensation
yeah,
that they
yeah,
have
yeah.
more resources, but then in a
Yeah,
few
it's a lack of
days,
maturity. And I don't want to like we're gonna spend another session maybe talking about kind of like the spiritual backbone. Why people think they should have something now as opposed to waiting. I think maturity is a tricky thing. Anyway, just kind of rounding out the hour here. I'm going to give you a final word for what you think. What's your prognosis in Ecuador and Argentina as far as the elections go, and then maybe their political futures, the kind of populist happiness and all that kind of stuff, and how this figures into Latin America as a whole.
I think in Ecuador, Noboa has the possibility of winning the elections in October. In Argentina, although Milei is the front runner and has a very appealing uh, idea on the what he calls the political caste, I think Silvina Patricia Bullrich could gather people, more moderate people that want change, not voting for the government candidate and not so extreme as Millet is. I think Bullrich has an opportunity for doing that, although Millet is the star, rising star in the Argentinian politics. The reflection that would I would do at this moment is that democracy is in a high risk in many countries, like in Latin American countries. We can discuss that in another opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I always like to end just with a little bit of self-promotion. Let's see if I can get it up quickly enough. If people want to help support this podcast, they can send me money by proxy. I have a book, um, Overturning Zika, and it's on Amazon. Here it is. And it's a good read. I've had good reviews on it, and it actually takes place in Latin America, in Brazil, a good fraction of it. And we haven't heard much about Zika in Colombia, Brazil, Latin America in general, but it was a big deal in 2015, 2016, and the WHO, through a lot of proxy physicians, tried to create a birth moratorium until there was a Zika vaccine. So they recommended no babies at all. And certain health ministers in, I think, El Salvador, Honduras, Jamaica, and provinces, states within Brazil followed along with this and recommended that people stop having babies. So it's just kind of a crazy story. You can buy it on Amazon. It's called Overturning Zika, and for the same price. Obviously, you get a picture of me on the cover. That's me early in the morning. Anyway, so thank you very much for listening, and please share this widely. And Carlos Blanco, you can find on Twitter at, what is your Twitter handle?
Carlos Blanco G.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Carlos. Hope to see you soon.